I mean, the trio, usually two of us take like background parts and then he'll do the bass line most of the time and then he says our beatbox.
There are groups that entertain, and then there are groups that make you feel something so deep, so pure, that the music stops being sound and becomes something closer to a heartbeat. Pentatonix was always the second kind. 5 voices, no instruments, no studio tricks, just human breath shaped into something that could fill an arena or break a silence in a grieving household at 3 in the morning. They became one of the most beloved vocal groups in the history of modern music, not because they were polished, though they were, but because when they sang together, something undeniably real passed between them and the listener. But here is what the world never fully understood about Pentatonix. Behind every flawless harmony, behind every Grammy acceptance speech, behind every YouTube video that racked up tens of millions of views, there was a story being lived that no camera ever truly captured. A story of exhaustion that settled into the bones, of identity quietly cracking under the pressure of constant performance, of a man who loved music more than fame and eventually had to choose between the two, of loneliness that doesn't disappear just because you're surrounded by people and applause. This is not a story about failure. Pentatonix never truly failed. This is something more complicated and far more human than that. This is a story about what success costs and whether the price was ever worth paying. To understand the tragedy, you have to go back to the beginning, back before the fame and the sold-out tours and the Christmas specials that became a tradition for millions of families. You have to go back to Arlington, Texas, where 3 teenagers were quietly finding each other in the most ordinary of settings, the hallways and classrooms of Martin High School. Scott Hoying was one of them, tall, magnetic, and consumed by music in a way that went beyond hobby or ambition. Scott didn't just want to perform. He needed to. Music was the language through which he understood himself and communicated with the world. Beside him was Kirsten Maldonado, whose voice carried a warmth that was impossible to manufacture, a natural clarity that could cut through noise and land directly in the chest. And then there was Mitch Grassi, a young man whose vocal range and theatrical instincts suggested he had been born slightly out of place in a regular high school, too extraordinary for the ordinary world around him. These 3 became close in the way that only people who recognize each other across a crowd can become close. They were all, in their own ways, outsiders. Too artistic, too emotionally open, too different from the culture surrounding them. But when they sang together, the awkwardness of being different dissolved entirely. In those moments, they weren't outsiders. They were something rare and undeniable. They were a sound. Their early experiments with harmony were unpretentious. A local radio contest here. A cover recorded for fun there. They lost a competition to meet the cast of Glee. It didn't matter. What mattered was that singing together felt like the safest place any of them had ever been. Music was not ambition yet. It was shelter. Years passed. Scott moved to Los Angeles to study at the University of Southern California, where he joined the SoCal Vocals, a respected collegiate a cappella group that deepened his understanding of what vocal music could be. But distance did nothing to dim his connection to Mitch and Kirsten. If anything, it clarified something essential. Whatever he was building, he needed them in it. The opportunity arrived in the form of NBC's The Sing-Off, a competition series that gave a cappella groups a rare moment of national visibility. Scott immediately felt pulled toward it. He called Mitch and Kirsten. There was one logistical problem. The show required groups of 5, and they were only 3. Fate, it turned out, had already made its arrangements. Avi Kaplan entered the picture first, a bass vocalist with a voice so deep and resonant that it seemed to come from somewhere geological rather than human. Avi was not simply talented. He was grounded in a way that went beyond musicianship. He had trained, he had studied, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that immediately anchored the group. Then came Kevin Olusala, a Yale-educated musician who had gone viral on the internet for an astonishing skill no one had ever seen combined before, playing the cello while simultaneously beatboxing. Kevin was not just a novelty. He was a genuine intellect, a disciplined artist who expanded what the group could imagine about itself. 5 strangers, one day together before their audition, and when they stood on that stage, something happened that none of them could have planned or rehearsed. The chemistry was immediate and undeniable. Their harmonies didn't just blend, they locked into each other with a precision that felt almost architectural. They won Season 3 of the Sing-Off in 2011, and the world suddenly knew their name. Victory should have been the beginning of a smooth ascent. Instead, it was immediately followed by one of the most painful lessons the music industry can teach. Epic Records signed them. Epic Records dropped them. Months passed between those two sentences, and in those months, the group learned something that would define everything that came after. The traditional music industry had no idea what to do with them. No one knew how to market an a cappella group to a mainstream audience. No one could fit them neatly into a genre. Executives looked at them and saw a problem to be solved rather than a phenomenon to be amplified. Being dropped from a major label early in a career carries a particular kind of humiliation, the sense that you have been measured by professionals and found insufficient. Many groups never survive it. Pentatonix was not most groups. They turned to YouTube, which in 2011 was still a platform people underestimated as a vehicle for serious artistic careers. From a small Los Angeles apartment, with minimal equipment and maximum determination, they began posting covers. The arrangements were sophisticated, the performances were tight, and the internet, unlike the label executives, understood immediately what it was hearing. Their cover of Somebody That I Used to Know exploded. Evolution of Music became a viral sensation. Video after video pulled in millions of views, and their subscriber count grew at a pace that surprised even the most optimistic observers. They built an audience of devoted fans, who called themselves Pentaholics, entirely on their own terms, without a label infrastructure, without commercial radio, without any of the traditional machinery that the industry insisted was necessary. It was a genuine revolution, and it was thrilling. But revolutions are exhausting to sustain. With millions of fans come millions of expectations, and those expectations arrived relentlessly. Every upload had to match or exceed what came before. Every arrangement had to justify the faith people had invested. The creative process, which had once felt like play, gradually began to feel like obligation. The joy was still there, but it was now threaded through with something heavier. The knowledge that a global audience was watching and waiting, and that disappointment was always one mediocre video away. Tours followed, then more tours. Album cycles that compressed the natural rhythms of creativity into industrial timelines. Rehearsals that demanded physical and emotional endurance. Photo shoots, press runs, promotional obligations that filled every remaining hour. The 5 members were no longer just artists. They were a brand, a product, a machine that had to keep producing or risk the whole structure collapsing. From the outside, they looked untouchable. 5 young people at the top of their field, doing what they loved, making music that connected with people across every continent. Their smiles in every photo were bright. Their performances were immaculate. The image they projected to the world was one of unity, joy, and effortless excellence. The image was not entirely false. They did love each other. They did love the music. But behind the image, each of them was quietly accumulating a weight that never fully showed on camera. Scott Hoying carried the burden of leadership with a grace that cost him privately. As the most publicly visible member, the one who often spoke for the group in interviews and who functioned as a creative anchor in the studio, he absorbed pressure that came from every direction simultaneously. Fans expected him to be the face of the group's optimism. The business side expected him to keep momentum alive. His bandmates needed him to be steady. He was steady, almost always. But steadiness maintained under that kind of sustained pressure requires constant suppression of doubt, fear, and exhaustion. For years, Scott suppressed all 3. When the world quieted in 2020, and the tour buses stopped moving, and the schedules cleared for the first time in nearly a decade, Scott was left alone with the questions he had been too busy to sit with. Questions about identity, about what he wanted independent of what was expected, about the anxiety that had run quietly beneath his confident public exterior for years. He began to confront those questions honestly for the first time, which was both a relief and a reckoning. Mitch Grassi had always been the group's most visually and vocally arresting presence, the member whose range and theatricality consistently drew gasps from audiences. But artistic brilliance lived inside Pentatonix, came with invisible constraints. The group's sound required cohesion, which meant individual artistic impulses sometimes had to be subordinated to the collective. Mitch had dimensions, darker, stranger, more experimental, that didn't always fit inside the frame that Pentatonix occupied. During the pandemic, he pursued a solo project called Mesa, which allowed him to explore those suppressed dimensions fully. The music was intimate and challenging, unlike anything he had ever made inside the group. It was also clearly necessary. Mitch had been carrying an unexpressed version of himself for years, and the weight of that had been more significant than most people realized. Kirsten Maldonado occupied a unique and quietly difficult position within the group as its only female member. The music itself made no distinction. Harmonies have no gender, but the world outside the music did. Kirsten navigated constant scrutiny that her bandmates simply did not face in the same way. She was evaluated differently, held to different standards, and often expected to function as an emotional balancer for the group in ways that went unacknowledged and uncompensated. She carried those expectations with remarkable composure, but composure is not the same as ease. Over time, the weight of being the one woman in a male-dominated lineup, in an industry that rarely treats women fairly, carved its own particular marks into her. The pandemic gave her space to reclaim parts of herself she had set aside for the sake of the group, and returning to solo music became an act of rediscovery that she described with a tenderness that made clear how much she had missed simply being herself. Kevin Alusalo was the member who most often appeared internally settled, grounded by faith, disciplined by years of rigorous musical training, and temperamentally suited to the demands of professional life. But even Kevin was not immune to the accumulating weight of the Pentatonix machine. Becoming a father fundamentally reorganized his sense of priority. The touring lifestyle that had once felt like adventure began to feel misaligned with the man he was becoming. He needed stillness and presence in a way that constant motion could not accommodate. His solo album, Dawn of a Misfit, became an act of self-examination, an artist using music to understand his own evolution. In interviews, Kevin spoke with unusual honesty about the gap between the person he had been performing and the person he was discovering. The gap was real. Crossing it required courage. And then there was Avi. Of all the members of Pentatonix, Avi Kaplan's story is the one that cuts deepest because it is the story of a person who simply could not reconcile who he was with the life he was living, and who had to choose honesty over comfort at an enormous personal cost. Avi was not built for the spotlight in the way that word is usually meant. He was built for depth, for quiet, for the kind of connection with music that happens in private, and resists being converted into spectacle. His voice was extraordinary, a bass so rich and resonant it seemed to have geological weight, but the voice had always been in service of something personal for him. Music, for Avi, was spiritual. It was a form of communion, not a form of entertainment. Those two things are not always incompatible, but inside the Pentatonix machine, which was growing larger and faster and louder every year, the distinction became increasingly difficult to maintain. Every tour meant months away from home, from family, from the natural world he found genuinely restorative. Every photo shoot and rehearsal required him to perform a version of himself that felt increasingly like a costume he was putting on rather than a self he was inhabiting. He loved his bandmates. That love was never in question. But love for people and love for a life are different things. And Avi slowly came to understand that he could love the four people he made music with while being unable to sustain the life that making music with them required. In 2017, Avi Kaplan announced that he was leaving Pentatonix. The farewell video he recorded was one of the most genuinely heartbreaking things any member of a successful group has ever shared publicly. He did not hide behind vagueness or industry language. He spoke plainly about what he was feeling, about the distance from family that had become unbearable, about the music that had stopped feeling true to him, about the need to find a life that was actually his own. There was no scandal, no falling out, no dramatic rupture between him and the remaining members. There was only a quiet, honest man telling the truth about what he could and could not survive. The fan response was enormous. Waves of grief and support that spread across social media for weeks. For many Pentaholics, Avi had been the soul of the group, the grounding presence whose deep voice gave the sound its spiritual weight. His absence felt like more than a musical change. It felt like the group had lost something essential about itself. And in some ways it had. Not because Avi was irreplaceable as a vocalist, though his voice was genuinely singular, but because his departure forced a confrontation with the truth the group had been living around rather than acknowledging. The cost of what they had built was real, and it was being paid in human beings. Matt Salih stepped into the role of bass vocalist with a humility that the situation demanded and a talent that the role required. He was warm, skilled, and possessed of a genuine gentleness that aligned well with the group's character. But he also walked directly into a grief he had not created, a fan base still mourning his predecessor, a group still processing the loss of a founding member, and an audience that would be watching to see whether he was worthy of the position he occupied. That kind of scrutiny would have broken many people. Matt navigated it with a quiet persistence that gradually earned him the respect and affection he deserved. He did not try to become Avi. He became himself, which was exactly the right choice, and also the only choice that could have worked. Over time, the fans who had grieved Avi's departure found space in their hearts for a genuine appreciation of what Matt brought. The wound did not close entirely. Wounds like that rarely do. But it healed around him. What does it mean to be Pentatonix today? It means carrying a decade and a half of history, some of it triumphant and some of it quietly devastating, into every room they enter. It means being a group that has survived a lineup change, a global pandemic, personal crises visible and invisible, and the relentless pressure of an audience that loves them with the particular intensity that only vocal music seems to generate. It means having learned, through experience rather than theory, that harmony is not a state you achieve and then maintain effortlessly. It is something you work for every day, in every relationship, in every creative decision, in every choice you make about what you are willing to sacrifice and what you are not. The tragedy of Pentatonix is not that anything went catastrophically wrong. No one died. No one destroyed the group in a moment of spectacular failure. The tragedy is subtler and more common, and, for that reason, more worth examining. The tragedy is that 5 enormously talented people gave an enormous amount of themselves to something beautiful, and the giving cost them more than the world ever saw or acknowledged. The tragedy is that one of them gave until he simply had nothing left to give in that particular direction, and had to walk away to survive. The tragedy is that success, real success, the kind that fills arenas and generates billions of views and earns multiple Grammy Awards, does not protect you from suffering. It simply changes the shape of the suffering and removes some of the permission to talk about it openly. What Pentatonix ultimately offers the world, beyond the music itself, is an honest accounting of what it costs to dedicate yourself completely to something. They did not hold back. They poured themselves into the work with a totality that is genuinely rare. And the work is extraordinary. The recordings they made together, the arrangements that reimagined pop songs as architectural structures, the harmonies that could make a crowded room go completely silent, those things are real achievements, and they will endure. But so will the stories behind them. The story of Avi choosing himself over his career, one of the most courageous things any artist can do. The story of Mitch finding in himself dimensions that fame had temporarily obscured. The story of Kirsten reclaiming a voice that had sometimes been drowned out even inside the group that needed it. The story of Kevin learning that his worth was not defined by his productivity. The story of Scott discovering that leadership does not require self-erasure. And the story of Matt walking into a storm with nothing but humility and talent and slowly, quietly, making himself at home. These are human stories. They are stories about the G.